Our thanks to the bell choir for that challenging work. It's kind of hard for me to imagine, especially those of you who are working with 3 bells. I only have 2 hands. So. Whatever you may suffer, speak the truth. Be worthy of the entire confidence of your associates. Consider what is right as what must be done. It is not necessary that you should keep your property or even your life, but it is necessary that you should hold fast to your integrity. These are words of William Ellery Channing, who is generally acknowledged as the founder of American Unitarianism. One of the things I've realized in the last few years in retirement is that my preaching over the years has sorely neglected Channing. But every once in a while, I do find myself astounded at a realization of just how much, not just his preaching, but his character has somehow continued to influence our movement, though he died going on 2 centuries ago. He was born in Rhode Island in 1780, had one ministry in Boston for over 40 years, and died in 1842. The first third of the 19th century, precisely from 2004, sure. The 19th century is 1804. I shouldn't do anything ad lib, I guess, anymore. 1804 to 1833, there's events that define that. And it's a period we call, in our history books at least, the Unitarian controversy, a splitting up of the original Puritan churches in New England into more liberal, that's us, and more conservative wings. The conservative histories, I learned some time ago, referred to it as the Unitarian departure. In those days, also, you should know that the word Unitarian was an epithet, just about the worst thing you could call anyone. And by the second decade of the 19th century, it became clear that the time had come to define the terms of this theological controversy. Now, by temperament, Channing had no taste for doctrinal controversy. As it has been famously said, if others were for division, Channing wanted unity. But when it became clear that division was unavoidable, it was Channing who would define the terms of engagement, if you will, in what is usually referred to as the Baltimore Sermon, delivered in a recently completed church of that city, which still stands today, on May 5th, 1819. He chose, as his title, Unitarian Christianity, eventually turning the epithet into a name that would stick for the heretofore diffuse company of those espousing liberal Christianity and what amounted to a party platform. 5 editions of his sermon were printed in the next 6 weeks, which was one of the 2 most widely circulated publications in early American history. Thomas Paine's Common Sense was the other. Already among the most eminent preachers in Boston, the influence of that single sermon made Channing the preeminent spokesman for the new movement and elevated him to the position of its consensual leader. However, his ambivalence in that role was highlighted just a few years later when he turned down the invitation offered him to accept the presidency of the American Unitarian Association upon its founding on May 25th, 1825. Both an idealist and an individualist, Channing was dubious about the value or efficacy. That's it, Earl. Efficacy of collective actions in general, as he wrote in this essay on associations. There is no moral worth in being swept away by a crowd, even toward the best objects. And he was wary in particular of the pernicious tendency in all religious controversy toward sectarianism. His desire to transcend the party spirit of the religious controversy that ironically he himself had helped foment is reflected in a letter to a friend where he wrote, "I am little a Unitarian and stand aloof from all but those who strive and pray for clearer light, who look for a purer and more effective manifestation of Christian truth." Channing's ideal was not a denomination, but connection to what he called the universal church, as he famously defined it in these words: "A church from which no man can be excluded, but by the death of goodness within his own breast." In another irony, the origins of the new Unitarian organization stemmed directly from conversations initiated by Channing himself, who in 1822 convened a discussion club called the Anonymous Association. Nobody knows who remembers. Which met initially in his Beacon Hill living room and ultimately proved the seedbed for the creation of the American Unitarian Association. Declining its presidency in 1825, Channing confessed that he was, quote, "a little disappointed at learning that a general Unitarian association is to commence its operation immediately," but added with what historian David Parkas called his characteristic ambivalence and unfailing charity, saying, "As you have made a beginning, I truly rejoice in your success." Ralph Waldo Emerson famously wrote that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. And I've sometimes wondered whether he might have had Channing in mind when he wrote that sentence. Whether he did or not, it seems to me that many of the best qualities which have characterized the Unitarian movement through the years may be seen as reflections of Channing, not only of his ideas and ideals, but of his character as well, and even his quirks, for ambivalence about the purposes and even the need for our national church organization has been a continuing theme in our history. When I study him, it is actually his character I think of first. Of the fact that Channing was a compelling and powerful preacher, there is ample testimony. It was said back then that visitors from Europe to America wanted most to do two things: to see Niagara Falls and to hear Channing preach. But his power came not from dramatic oratory or pulpit flamboyance. And the way he preached is the way most of us preach today. Hiding behind a pulpit, reading our texts. He gestured rarely. His voice was not loud. According to reports, this has always interested me, the acoustics were so bad in that just completed church in Baltimore in 1819 that almost no one behind the third pew heard a word of his 90-minute sermon. Maybe that's why they published it. No, his power derived from the clarity of his thought and expression, the thoughtfulness and directness of his message, and above all, the obvious depth and sincerity of his belief. He meant every word. He embodied the kind of integrity which I associate with those who express their faith not only with their lips, but in their lives, in whom precept and example are one. Those who are simply incapable of hypocrisy. Such qualities, obviously, are not limited to the members of any particular sect or by adherence to any particular doctrine, but they do derive from religious seriousness. In this instance, taking to heart and into our lives the plain lessons of Scripture and the example of Christ. Channing took as his text for the Baltimore sermon a verse from St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. "Prove all things, hold fast to what is good. Read that sermon today, and 2 points stand out above and beyond the rest: the infinite goodness of God and the potential goodness of all of God's children, each one made in the image of the divine, or as he called it in perhaps his greatest sermon, our likeness to God. There he wrote, "True religion consists in proposing as our great end a growing likeness to God. God becomes a real being to us in proportion as his own nature is unfolded in us. To one who is growing in the likeness of God, faith begins, even here, to change into vision. He carries within himself a proof of deity which can only be understood by experience." Note the emphasis on words like growing and unfolding. The divinity within the human soul is not something magically attained or implanted in its full form, but something which by effort we can grow into. There are no limits to the growth of this moral force in man, Channing said, if he will cherish it faithfully. This firm conviction of the presence of God's attributes in human nature became for Channing the first principle of theological truth. Near the end of his life, as he wrote the preface for his 5-volume collected works, he summarized his works very simply in one sentence: "The following writings will be found to be distinguished by nothing more than by the high estimate which they express of human nature." And it is this high estimate, this optimistic estimate, we might say, of human nature and human potential, which is the deep theological grounding of the first of the 7 denominational principles we have today, which undergirds and supports the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It also underlies every seriously considered statement of our faith from Channing's era to ours today. You'll have to take my word for that, at least for now. One biographer of Channing wrote that, quote, "His whole spiritual pursuit can be thought of as an attempt to make plain those divine principles written on our souls." Those of you who were here last Sunday will know that our current purposes and principles, the principles and purposes of the UUA, were formally adopted in 1985, replacing the original version adopted at the time of the Unitarian and Universalist denominations joining together in around 1960. Read side by side, as I somewhat unsuccessfully tried to do last Sunday, some of you will remember, you'll find more similarity than differences between the two versions, both in tone and content. But most importantly, neither one is a statement of beliefs. Rather, they are aspirations or aspirational. Aspirations meaning hoped-for goals, intentions, ideals. The original principles stated that as congregations we unite in seeking these particular goals. The revised version says instead that we covenant to affirm and promote them. As far as I'm concerned, that comes down to the same thing. But where did they get those particular words? Well, the answer is they borrowed them from the wording of just one of the original principles, which reads in full. This is Article 3 on the one that's hanging in the office. "We seek to affirm, defend, and promote the supreme worth of every human personality, the dignity of man, and the use of the democratic method in human relationships." Even if you're only slightly familiar with the current principles, all of those words should sound familiar. Affirm and promote, as noted, is used in the preamble. The inherent worth and dignity of every person is the first principle. and the use of the democratic process is highlighted in the fifth. At first, it struck me as strange that in the earlier principles, the worth and dignity of individuals was linked directly to the democratic method. But if you think about it, democracy is built upon the same optimistic estimate of human nature and human potential that is central to our faith, which I suppose raises a question about whether there is a differentiation between a sacred and secular faith. I'll save that also for another day. But however you look at it, affirming the value of each individual's worth and dignity cannot be separated from other assertions that all human beings are created equal, that all lives matter, which are, along with liberty, the essential democratic values. I think that the term inherent worth is an improvement over supreme worth, though with his high estimation and idealistic faith in persons, Channing would probably prefer supreme. The great hope of society is in individual character, he declared. But it is understood that while all are created equal, all are not the same. Each of us is meant to have a character all our own. Each of us is meant to have a character all our own, he said, to be what no other can exactly be and do what no other can exactly do. As I understand him, the good society must be built from the bottom up. The popular 19th century novelist Edward Bellamy declared that the primal principle of democracy is the worth and dignity of the individual. The contemporary Canadian writer Naomi Klein wrote something similar, observing that democracy is not just the right to vote, it's the right to dignity. The British poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who knew him, believed Channing's character to be the very rarest in earth. And he said, I love this quote, it's the only reason I put it in here. He has the love of wisdom and the wisdom of love. Let me read again how I began. Whatever you may suffer, speak the truth. Be worthy of the entire confidence of your associates. Consider what is right as what must be done. It is not necessary that you should keep your property or even your life, but it is necessary that you should hold fast to your integrity. And then one more aphorism from him. We look forward to the time when the power to love will replace the love of power. Then will our world know the blessings of peace. So may it be.